Cyndi Darnell, welcome to the Orgasmic Lifestyle Podcast, where every day is a climax. It's a real pleasure to have you here. For those who are
Thank you,
unfamiliar
Megan.
with your work, could you tell us what you do?
So I'm a sex and relationships therapist, and I authored a book called Sex When You Don't Feel Like It: The Truth About Mismatched Libido and Rediscovering Desire.
Mhm.
And one of the big topics that comes up in my work for a lot of people is this question of libido and desire, how if we have too much or not enough, or it's different than our partners, or it's different than our friends, and what is it supposed to be? Should we even have it? And that's what inspired me to write the book.
Mhm. And what else do you do? Are you also a therapist?
Yeah, but I focus primarily on sex and relationships. I was trained originally in mental health counseling,
Mhm.
but it's not something that I spend a whole lot of time on these days because my focus has since moved across to sex and relationships. And I'm especially interested in alternative relationship structures these days more than traditional relationships. I still work with people in traditional relationships, but I think increasingly we're having more and more public discussions about the role and the function of traditional relationships and really who they are for and who they benefit, and also the impact of them on our sex lives, because I think historically traditional relationships really were oriented around men, around productivity, around ownership, and a lot of people across the gender spectrum are finding that that style of relating is it's very limited, and it does tend to produce a lot of resentment and restriction in terms of how we love, how we fuck,
Mhm.
who we fuck, and under what conditions we do it. And I don't necessarily have a whole lot of answers, but I have a lot of questions, and these are questions that I spend a lot of time talking to my clients about, and gleaning people's insight around what works for them. And often that is stuff that sits outside the square, which starts telling us that perhaps how we understand sex and relationships from a conventional lens, what we're expected to do, doesn't necessarily actually fit what feels good. And I'm very interested in what feels good rather than what looks good.
Absolutely, because relationships are supposed to feel good, isn't it? We'll dive into that in a moment. So, what inspired you to follow this path?
So I grew up in Australia where sex and relationships education at that time was, pretty limited, and I think it still is. And increasingly, I don't necessarily think school is a place where sex education. It's not whether it should or it shouldn't happen. I don't really have a position on it, but overwhelmingly, it doesn't happen. And, with the exception of a handful of countries in Northern Europe, it predominantly doesn't really happen. And then even if it does happen, we understand that sex and relationships exist in this other kind of very broad context that where we learn it through trial and error, we learn it through movies, and increasingly these days we learn it through podcasts and porn,
Mhm.
which is all fine. Um, but what it means is that we don't have a lot of places to integrate the information that we absorb from online. So I got into this work because, when I was a much younger person, I had a lot of questions about sex that were never answered, that nobody could answer. And back in the day when I first started doing this work, there was no internet, there was nowhere to go to get information. And and I also found it was at that time also really difficult for women to talk about sex because nobody really talked about women and pleasure. It was entirely the role of reproduction, and that has never been of interest to me. I still don't have any interest in fertility and pregnancy and all of those things. I mean, people do it, obviously, but it's not something that I've ever been interested in, and it's certainly not something that I talk about in my work because I recognize it's adjacent to it, and I certainly believe in reproductive rights. But pregnancy is, for me personally, the least interesting aspect of human sexuality.
It's interesting because I was brought up Catholic, so it was only about
Mm,
pregnancy, the
right.
education that we received. And I remember my religion teacher saying, a husband loves his wife so much, he puts his penis inside her vagina.
Yeah.
And then I
What a
used to
load of
think,
shit that is.
and I just thought, when families had 5 kids, they've done it 5 times. And then if they had 2 kids, they've done it twice. So I just thought, it was in guaranteed pregnancy.
Right.
And on this podcast, I've done about 117 episodes. I've only interviewed one expert on fertility, which is kind of interesting
Mm,
because that's
mm.
what people, 50 years ago, that's what it was only about that, really. So pleasure
Well,
is a
that's
huge
what we were
construct. Yeah.
told that sex
Mm,
is for reproduction, when I actually think
mm,
sex is it's almost a religion. It's a
mm,
spiritual transitional experience, and it can produce life in some contexts if you
mm,
do it in a certain way with the right, apparatus. But for most people, that's not why they have sex, and so
mm,
I'm much more interested, and my whole entire work philosophy comes from why we do the things we do rather than adhering to some kind of script about what men are supposed to be and what women are supposed to be. And
mm,
I don't really care what we're supposed to be. I want to know, what do you want to be? How do you
mm.
want to show up?
So
Mm.
going back to what you said earlier about alternative relationships, traditional relationships, can you describe what you mean by an alternative relationship?
So, I mean, I'll start by talking about a traditional relationship. A traditional relationship is a monogamous heterosexual relationship. We all know what that is. We've all grown up with it, either by association or, just having it shoved down our throats through the media, through the mainstream media, that is this aspirational thing that we should all be aiming for. And then, 10, 15, 20 years ago, lots and lots of Western countries um, adopted variations on marriage equality policies where same-sex couples could get married, which, is great. And what it did do is it gave legal rights to people who deserve them, and it didn't do anything, though, to change or to inquire about the structure of these relationships. It just said people who traditionally were exiled from these rights now get to have the rights. So you get to be as miserable as everybody else. All right, hooray. And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek because I recognize that for a lot of people, the marriage trajectory, especially for younger people, the marriage trajectory is still a very strong influence because we have been told that that is the apex of human desire to be married, to perhaps have a family is this thing. And it's become much more glorified even in recent years with this trend around trad wives and
Mm,
these hyper masculine influences and all this kind of stuff, that it's all coming from that place of this tradition is how it's supposed to be.
mm,
But the reality is that even though humans have tried to shoehorn themselves into these structures for centuries, they've never really worked because they've never really been about humans asking themselves, does this fit for me? It's been entirely, for women, it's been about survival. For queer people, it's been about survival. And I think even for actually, honestly, for men, it doesn't really serve men. It serves them superficially in that they get to say, well, this offspring came out of my penis, and
mm,
therefore all the money that I earn, I can spend on this offspring because it's connected to my penis. But that puts a lot of pressure on men to just be workhorses and to disconnect from their own inner world, their own relational capacity, because they see themselves only as providers because of this idea of hypermasculinity that they've been spoon-fed. So if we're looking at all of this as the traditional relationship model, I am interested in relationship models that are not that. And that could be all kinds of things. So it could be polyamory.
mm,
It could be alternative family structures. It could be things like chosen family. It could be people adopting children at an older age or adopting children as a trio rather than as a duo. It could be looking at different kinds of partnership structures that are perhaps not necessarily polyamorous, but just certainly non-monogamous, these kinds of things,
mm,
where the emphasis is on what's going to be good for me, what's going to be good for my partners, and then also sort of separating it out a little bit from capitalism, because part of the way that traditional relationship structures have been upheld is through these structures of, the church, through capitalism, through gaining and retaining wealth. Because if you can control the flow of cash, you can control who gets to have the power and who gets to have the babies and all that kind of stuff. So if you can afford to live well, you can have more babies. And so, a man can sire however many children and perhaps have however many wives and girlfriends, but it's still very much contained in that model. The women, I mean, they get a say somewhat, but really it's entirely about the men having whatever they're having, and the women are still, and then children remain in service to them. And in some parts of the world, that still is how things run. And it's not to say that it's good or bad. I don't necessarily have an opinion. I mean, I question it because it's very much geared certainly just to men, and and that really is a bit boring. But um I'm beyond that. It's not even looking at the opposite of traditional relationship structures, because I think that keeps us stuck in a binary to say, well, if men can have it, then women can have it too, or queer people can have it too. Sure, but why would we want to replicate something that is inherently rooted in dishonesty and inequality? Let's
Mm,
rebuild it from the ground up. That's what I'm interested in. And so, for that reason, I don't necessarily prescribe a model that we should all be going this way.
mm,
But instead, I really invite people to ask questions about the way that they live their lives currently. And does it bring you satisfaction? Is it meaningful? Do you feel that you have connections with the people around you, whether those people are your spouses, your neighbors, your friends, your co-workers?
mm.
How do you develop connection in your life? Because without connection, what's the point?
Yeah.
Honestly, like so many people feel so disenfranchised and disembodied because they're not connected to themselves. They're certainly not connected to their spouses. Just because they're wearing a ring and they've got a bit of paper in some dusty drawer somewhere, that's not connection.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
yet we are told that that is the aspiration, and we are never given the skills to learn how to connect. And so I'm much more interested. And I find that people sort of in their 40s, 50s, 60s are increasingly interested in connection because they tried the traditional models in their 20s and 30s and went, fuck this, it doesn't work.
Mm,
But they don't know where else to go. They have this felt sense that something's not quite right, but they stick with what they know because the thought of veering off the path feels confronting. And I understand that it is confronting because there is nowhere else to go. We've only ever been told that there is this one way. But if we dare give ourselves permission to expand the vision just slightly to say, wow,
mm,
what would happen if I changed the way I viewed relationships? And then perhaps I invited some friends to have those discussions with me. What could, this is all very hypothetical, but what could we make possible? How could my life be different if I dared to follow what felt good rather than what was expected of me?
mm,
And this, I think, especially in the wake of all of the political upheaval that the world is going through, we have to turn to each other. Pleasure is very political, and I'm increasingly outspoken about this because I think there is to be so superficial as to say, oh well, it doesn't affect me, I'm okay. It's like it's horseshit. It affects all of us.
mm,
And so we are all ethically, I think, obliged to look at the structures that we live in and say, who benefits from these? Honestly,
mm,
who are these structures serving? And most of the time, they are not serving the people who are in them. They're serving, some other
mm.
governments or banks or parents or, you know, clergy, religious leaders, rabbis, priests, whoever.
Because I
And
think
it,
that when
it
these
just,
structures were created, they were created at a time when, life expectancy was very different. So now,
absolutely.
we're spending, 40, 50 years with some person, and it's very unlikely that you're going to move in the same direction, and then it just becomes a victim of habit or a result of habit. And
Right, and that's the
yeah.
thing. And because
Mm,
that is, an inevitable truth
Mm,
that you're going to grow apart from the person that you married when you were 20. Not because you're a bad person, not because they're a bad person, and not because your relationship is a failure. I never describe relationships as failures.
mm,
Um, but because you're going to expand. I mean, that we're going to change, we're going to grow. And
mm,
because growth is not encouraged, that staying in the mold like a bird in a cage, just staying as you were, is considered noble. It's considered, you get your rewards if you deny yourself growth and pleasure, that is somehow admirable. And again, it brings me back to who does these structures serve? Why would we live like this?
mm.
Why do we want a population of miserable beige people? Like,
Yeah, what I find is challenging in the relationship sphere is that I think a lot of us we do feel disconnected. I mean, myself yesterday, I mean, the whole of Spain was without power. I couldn't even make a phone
mhm,
call. I didn't want to go
mhm.
to the street. It was just I didn't want to go down this dark stairwell. So
Wow.
how could I even can't send a message, can't make a call, and then you just realize, oh, we are so disconnected. I
Mhm.
can't even reach out to anyone in that situation.
Mm.
But I also think that we all crave connection. But I also think one of the big obstacles of finding a relationship, no matter what type of relationship, is the lack of good, positive role models around us. Because a lot of
Mhm.
people, we all know
Mhm.
people who have these, insta perfect relationships, but we know in the behind those perfect pictures, there's a lot of, things happening that we don't envy.
That's right.
So that's been one of my
That's
big obstacles. It's like, oh my God, looking at what's around me, I'm not really
Mhm.
that inspired. I feel lucky sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
it makes
No,
it even more difficult, not just like of a happiness or it doesn't really matter what the structure is. So then creating a new structure is hard to know where the influence from what I want to what's considered correct because there's
that's
all
right.
these because we're all part of society and then our families, what they expect from us. It's a whole
Mm.
there's a lot, it's so layered. Mhm.
That's right. That's right. And I think, because a lot of us tend to default to traditional relationships because that's all we've ever been exposed to, even though we know. And we had parents, if our parents were together and we had straight heterosexual parents, it's inevitable that somebody cheated somewhere along the way, or that
Mm,
somebody had an affair, or somebody, or someone, our friend from school's parents had an affair, or these kinds of things. Like we all know that it's all lies, but the being able to lean into it feels really scary because one of the fabulous marketing aspects of monogamy and traditional relationships is that it tells us that all of our insecurities will go away if we do this. And that's a very appealing marketing ploy to go, wow, if I do this, I will never feel anxious and insecure again. I'm sold. Take my money.
mm,
And so people do it,
mm,
only to find that it's not really sustainable. And it's not because the model is flawed, although I think it is, but it's because we are not taught the skills to uphold these structures. We are just told, do this, don't question it, head down, butt up, do it, and everything will be fine. And so we are then at that moment taught to cut off from our intuition, cut off from our inner voice that asks us, could there be something different? Not even necessarily more, but just different.
mm,
What else is possible here? And again, it's about that idea of satisfaction, not that we have to be gorging and having multiple, lovers and orgies and that kind of stuff all the time. I mean, for some people that would be ideal, I guess. But that's also not necessarily what I'm suggesting. I also think that actually would be unsustainable.
mm,
But more about if we focus our attention on how do we create meaningful connections, whether they are mental connections, emotional connections, sexual connections, social community-based connections, economic connections, whatever the connections are. We need multiple layers of connection. We are humans, we are not solitary animals. That we know for sure. And because we deny that part of ourselves through traditional relationship structures, it those feelings have to go somewhere. And that, that suppression can lead to, and this is, the mental health training part of my history, leading to feelings of anxiety, leading to feelings of depression, leading to feelings of loneliness, leading to feelings of isolation, because increasingly, especially with all of, internet and stuff, we have this illusion of connection.
Mm.
My entire professional life is online. Everything I do is online. So I know I'm also part of this system. Um, I very rarely see people in person. And that is the world that we live in. And so on one hand, there are so many benefits to it, but the shortcomings are that we are increasingly losing connection. This new AI thing, goodness knows the impact that that's going to have on us. I think it's amazing.
Mm.
And I also think it could be really dangerous.
Yeah, I've
I
been
don't know.
watching
We'll see.
Black Mirror. Yeah, I've been watching Black Mirror this last week. It's been crazy. But is there any type of, let's say, relationship that you have witnessed that's highly unconventional, but you've seen that it works really well without mentioning names or anything? Is there any kind of situation that you've that's really kind of from the outside very unusual, but you've seen that it works well?
I see a lot of people in their 50s, 60s, 70s married, living apart, living in separate
Okay.
houses. And
Was
that
that
works
first
very
marriage or second? Because because I know a lot of people who are divorced, they're like, never
um
live with anyone again. They kind of
some are
support that.
some are first, but they started late, like they got
Oh,
married in
okay.
their 40s. And then
Mm,
some are second and third marriages. And sometimes it takes that level of practice, and there's
mm,
no shame in getting it wrong the
mm,
first or second time. Um, but this is what I mean about, non-traditional relationship structures, that they're ostensibly married, perhaps for tax purposes or whatever, but
mm,
um, they live in separate houses and they maintain separate lives to a degree. They're very connected. They see each other often and they really invest in keeping the relationship alive. Sometimes they have other lovers, sometimes that's not so important to them. So I see that.
mm,
And certainly here in New York, where I live, polyamory is very commonplace.
mm.
Um, it's almost as if I think being monogamous in New York City is people are like, oh, really? Um,
Exotic.
yeah, well, it just seems a bit stuffy, but
Mm,
and again, like not to say that monogamy is bad necessarily, but my thing is it's not about how one should or shouldn't live. But the reasons that you're doing it, have you checked in with yourself? What motivates you? Is it just to placate insecurity, or is it because you have, thought about this every which way and you've decided, no, this is a style that I want to pursue because of this, that, and the other reason? That is really what motivates me more, that self-inquiry around how am I going to live in alignment
mm,
with myself in such a way that brings me peace and joy and the capacity to be a good community member rather
mm,
than just playing musical chairs and going, well, I'm 25 and I want to have kids, so I'll just grab onto you and let's do it, which I think is what a lot of people actually do. And then they stay together, not because they're in love or connected or any of those things, but because they're terrified of change.
mm,
And that's when the mental health issues really kick in. But, when apparently we're not allowed to say that. So, I mean, I say it obviously because it's my world that I move through. But I see so much of that. So you were asking more about, relationships that work. I do tend to see it more with older people, and I think it's because they've had more life experience. I think it's because they are braver. They are more inclined to throw off convention and say, well, listen, I tried to toe the line for 25 years and it didn't work for me. And so now I'm gonna do it my way and I don't care what other people think. And that's not to say we should all necessarily be running around being rabid individualists. I don't think that's healthy or helpful. Um, but that part of us that can say, I'm going to buck convention, and if it makes other people uncomfortable, I'm okay with that. But I am doing this because ultimately I am tired of living, um, with my flag only half raised because I
mm,
was trying to fit into a system that didn't actually care about my well-being. And I think at some level we do have to then take the bull by the horns and say, this system that I tried to live under made me feel crushed, made me feel unworthy, made me feel, whatever, fill in the blank. And I don't want to live like this anymore. And I want to invest my energy in learning the skills to be the kind of citizen that I want to be. And I think that that is a really valuable pastime because, when we have, and I often think about this through the lens of end of life discussions.
Mm,
When you're taking your last breath, what's going to matter to you? Are you gonna be more concerned about, what your neighbors thought of you, or how you felt in your heart? Were you surrounded by people who saw you in ways that you wanted to be seen? Do you feel like you lived a life that you could be proud of, that was meaningful to you? Or did you just do what you thought you were supposed to do because you didn't want to check in with yourself, or you didn't want to take a risk to say, maybe I could live a different way? I think it's sad when folks get to towards the last decade of their lives and think, oh my goodness, I wasted so much time trying to be, a round peg in a round hole when
mm,
actually I was a triangle the whole time and I didn't give myself permission to be a triangle. I
mm,
think that's really, really sad.
definitely. So we touched earlier on fertility or people having sex to have babies. So what do you think beyond fertility? What is the purpose of sex?
I think it can be whatever you want it to be. I
Mm,
think for some people it's, mental health medication.
mm.
I think for some people it's
Already better
validation,
than a lot of things. Yeah, absolutely.
you you know. It's validation. For some people it's, just like having a beer.
Mm,
It's just, it's like it's how they kind of can connect. For some people it's a spiritual practice. It's a pathway to another dimension.
yeah.
It's lots of things to lots of different people. So I wouldn't ever say, it's this. Like
Mm,
it can be so many things to people. Um, and that's why I think for me, the fertility aspect is, I mean, it's the least interesting part because I'm not interested in babies. Like I don't give a shit about human babies that much. But that makes me sound terribly callous, and I'm not. I love living creatures. I'm just not oriented towards babies and motherhood. I think it's almost fetishized in our culture. But um, I am very interested in people making meaning of their sex lives. And if for them, sex and motherhood is the absolute pinnacle of their lives and they want to have 500 babies because they can, I would support them in that.
mm.
I just don't necessarily, certainly I wouldn't say to people that that's what it's for, though. I think that's such a reductive way of thinking about sex, and increasingly too, it's an opportunity for us to explore our emotional world. Sex is the place that our unprocessed emotions go to get processed. So we will meet parts of ourselves through sex that we
Mm.
will not meet in other ways. And I think that that is also a really fundamentally important therapeutic aspect of sex, especially partnered sex.
Oh, for sure. Definitely, definitely. I think I read something once in a magazine. I think they had this supplement about the best sex ever, and it was people giving their accounts of their best sex ever. And someone mentioned that it was the day they conceived their daughter. And it was written in such a beautiful way because I can understand, I can empathize with two people who love each other, wanting to create life. I know that in the reality, when people get obsessed, it's like, come on, ovulating. It's not new. It can get very mechanical, maybe not so beautiful, but it just sounded, really beautiful, like this love making, person making. It was just really, but then I've also read this book, which is amazing, called No Kids, 40 Reasons Not to Have Kids. And if you're not if you're sure if you've heard of this book, it's
I
amazing.
have not.
And they list all of these 40 reasons and they don't mention pelvic floor in it. So there's 41 reasons. But it's really interesting. But I think it's I think also what I find difficult about having unconventional sex lives, unconventional relationships, is that your family structures around you might not validate the seriousness of your relationship. Sometimes because I mean
Absolutely.
this is really
Absolutely.
invalidating, gaslighting almost. Because I know I'm from an Irish Catholic family, and I know that I've had cousins and stuff who are living with their partners, you know, have mortgages, but because there's no ring on the finger, if they go and visit someone, they have to sleep in separate rooms, and you know,
Yeah.
it's really like, oh no, wedding, then you know. So this is
Mm.
comes goes beyond families as well.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and also
And
spouse
that's why I
privileges and
think,
joy.
yeah, and over the years, there are pockets of the world where these traditions still are very strong, whether they're, Catholic or Muslim or Jewish or,
Mm,
there are variations of it, I think, in lots of different religious contexts. And, breaking through that is difficult for people because of this idea that, f the nuclear family or even perhaps a slightly broader version of family is so central
mm,
to so many of these religious institutions. But part of the reason that it is that way is because this is how these institutions have power over people by putting the fear in them that if they stray, they will be excommunicated from the family or excommunicated from the, institution or, these threats of being exiled. And we know that in our DNA as humans, being exiled is terrifying. Nobody wants to be kicked out. Nobody wants to not be in the tribe because you won't survive. We need each other. And this is where this hardwiring for connection is so crucial. So people will toe the line rather than risk being exiled. And this is why I'm especially interested in the notion of chosen family, that if you are from a blood family who don't respect you, who don't care about you, who want you to only toe the line because it serves them. And they don't care, like, if you're a queer person or you're a transgender person or you're in some other way, unconventional. And the threat is you must toe the line or be exiled. That's a
mm,
hell of a way to live
mm,
for, 70, 80, however many years that you're on the planet. And so a lot of people will stay because the terror of having to remove themselves, extrapolate themselves from their families of origin is terrifying. And then there are those who have to, they get found out being, different, queer, whatever. And then they end up being exiled
mm,
and they have to find other ways of surviving. And then we end up with like chosen family, which we see in shows like Pose and places where young queer people will gather and form different kinds of family connections. Now, this is not just queer people, people who are ostensibly heterosexual can also find themselves squished into these models because the heterosexuality also exists on a spectrum. It's not just, that all straight people are the same. They're not.
mm,
Um, and so our erotic proclivities, our, sensual personalities, our longings in life, if we, just something as banal as not wanting to have babies, can for some people be the reason you get kicked out of the family because you just either you can't or you won't or you just don't want to. That can really challenge the status quo of the power dynamic in the family, and you can be exiled for simply not wanting what your family want for you.
mm,
Chosen family is crucial then, and that is finding maybe partners, but certainly, community, friends who have your back, that if you get sick, if you get cancer, are going to look after you, who, if you become unhoused for some reason, you can go and live with them. Like that level of commitment to family,
mm.
I think is really important for people whose family of origins are less than ideal, which really is a lot of people.
Yeah,
A lot
especially
of
here in
people.
Barcelona, as a big, you know, I'm part of the expat community, and in Barcelona is a type of place where that attracts people who are, you know, child-free by choice, etc.
Mhm.
So there ends up being this kind of big community, very tight knit. Even if you don't like someone, you can still ask someone for a favor, and that's a beautiful thing, actually, that someone
Mm.
will, you know, look after you. And just recently, someone actually passed away, and I just thought it was amazing how people dealt with it and came together and had memorials, and
Mm.
just even people didn't know this person. It was just this human empathy and connection. And oh wow, this person is not from here, but we're gonna all remember him, and it was really
Mhm.
beautiful to see. Also in the Americans community here, there's a lot of kind of older people, but they don't make you feel like, oh, they've got no kids. I feel sorry for them. They're not alone at all. They have a lot of people
Right.
around them. So, because that's
Yeah.
another thing about, myth of child freedom. Who's going to look after you when you're older? But they could go and live in Australia, or
Mm.
just don't know. There's no
Right. I mean,
guarantee.
and that's, yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's the whole thing is having children. And back in the day where people had 10, 15, whatever children because they knew half of them wouldn't survive. They would die from,
Mm,
you know, polio and the plague and whatever else was going around. Um, and then it was the thing of, well, you would have children because there were no other safety nets. And
mm,
as communities and larger clusters of people were disappearing, as humans, we did rely on younger people to take care of us. But increasingly, that is happening less and less for a multitude of reasons. And we have, most Western countries at least, do have aging populations because we are not having as many children. Um, and I think a lot of that has to do with people really beginning to question these structures and who they serve and how our lives are organized.
mm. Tell us about your book. The
Ask me a
So
question
the
about.
mismatched libido. Why did you find that was a common problem? What inspired you to actually choose
Yes,
this topic?
I think every couple has a mismatched libido. There's not a couple
Mm,
on the planet who are entirely in sync all the time. That's all. That's all part of
mm,
the lies. Um, so rather than looking at mismatched libido as a problem to be solved,
mm,
I talk about it in the book as a quest to be seized, and I teach people the skills that they need to navigate the differences in libido, to be able to find out how they can create some kind of equilibrium if they can. Some couples can't.
mm,
And then it's also about being able to tolerate the emotions that come with asking yourself these questions about your desires and sex. That if you can't work it out with your partner, and especially if you're in a monogamous relationship, that does put a lot of pressure on you to, get it right.
mm,
Um, but if you can't, what do you do with that?
mm,
Because we can't be going around forcing people to have sex against their will just to keep a relationship going. That's not going to work. Or it's not going to work long term. And then a lot of people who are in relationships where their libidos are mismatched, will also say that they don't necessarily want their partners, forcing it. So it's
mm.
not that they want their partners to act like they're into it. They want the partner to be genuinely into it.
Of course.
And so that genuine enthusiasm for sex has to be internally generated, but it doesn't come from being horny. It doesn't come from lube and vibrators. It doesn't come from lingerie and high heels. It comes from understanding what your erotic motivations are, whether they are, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, financial, mental, like whatever. There are so many layers and ways that we interpret what turns us on, that going through the motions of that is crucial before we even get to the horniness part, because we have this very reductive idea of libido being, I'm either horny or I'm not, as if it's this switch, you can just switch it on and off. And horniness is helpful and it's awesome when it happens. It's great. So for people who don't struggle with horniness, then, I'm not talking to them necessarily
Mm,
right now. They're fine. They're okay with it. But they will eventually get to a point in their life, potentially, maybe, where horniness will be a bit elusive, and they'll be like, I used to be horny all the time, and now I'm not. This is certainly true for women in menopause. They'll go through a period, generally, um, for, at least a couple of years, if not 5 or so years, and some like permanently, where whatever horniness was once there has just gone. And
mm,
for some, it's a relief. For some, it's really devastating. And while things like hormone replacement therapy and stuff really help. And I certainly encourage people to do that if that's something that is accessible to them and their bodies can do it and all of that kind of stuff. I think that stuff is wonderful. But even still, um, for men and for younger people who experience, you know, unreliable, uh, an unreliable relationship with their libido,
Mm,
it's helpful to understand that sex is so much more and desire is so much more than what makes me horny. It
mm,
can be about what do I need in order for my desire to emerge. And so, some of the more mainstream science around it talks to us about this notion of responsive and spontaneous desire, which is spontaneous desire is what we've been marketed through Hollywood and porn, that you are just, you know, in the supermarket and you get a glimpse of the cucumbers and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, David, and I'm ready to go. And that's spontaneous desire, and that's fine.
mm,
Like, that happens to some people some of the time, but it's not reliable and it's pretty infrequent. Um, the alternative is responsive desire, and that means that we respond sexually to a set of cues, and the cues might be visual, but they might be emotional, they might be mood-based, they might be related to how we are being treated by another person. They might relate to how we feel about ourselves. When we look in the mirror, do we feel like we look good or not? It might be related to our hormone cycle. It might be related to have we drunk enough water?
mm,
Dehydration can really kill your libido. It might be related to illness. It might be like there are so many things that impact our ability to show up sexually. And so I think this very mainstream view of desire as this thing that, the right vibrator and the right lube is going to solve all your problems.
mm,
That's not even in the ballpark of the stuff that I have researched. Vibrators and lube do nothing for people, again, who are disconnected from themselves. It comes back to this thing of connection, of knowing what gets you, in the mood. And so this idea of having a responsive desire, being able to say, well, when I have felt like it, these are the conditions under which it's happened for me. So
mm,
what does that tell me about what my body needs in order to start to show up sexually? And then if you are in a relationship, that's the kind of information you want to share with a partner. Ideally, that partner will be receptive to what you're saying and be like, all right, well, let's make this a project we can do together. What can happen sometimes, though, is that people say, wow, I know this about myself. They say it to their partner, and their partner says, I don't want to do that.
mm. Yeah.
Right? And then we have a very different relationship problem. Then we don't, it ceases to be a sex problem at that point, and it starts becoming a relationship problem. Because if we are with partners who insist that it's my way or the highway, that's very, very hard to create meaningful connection, especially when you're looking for sex to be where you're both enthusiastic about it. It does require this give and take. And so this is where the skill building comes into it, learning how to be in attunement with each other, learning how to be in flow with each other. A lot of people don't know how to do that, or they can't be bothered learning how to do it. And that is a big problem.
I think that's also
So a
a
lot of my
big
work
problem for even
teaching
just in the
people that.
relationship or the emotional sphere. You've got to be both
Mm,
devoted to the relationship, not just,
that's exactly right.
I think that's
Yeah.
the most important thing. And then when you don't have that, or it's just one person initiating all this growth, then it just feels very lopsided. And I've been in situations where on both sides where I was the one wanting more sex, and then I've always been also been the one kind of giving excuses, and it was kind of I had a lot
Mhm.
of pressure, being a sexpert. People assume you want to have sex all the time. And then
Yeah.
I was thinking I'd rather have sex myself, rather than with this person.
Right. And that's
And
the
it's
thing.
it's
It
very
can,
hard. And then there's also
the
times of the
pressure is
day,
on.
sometimes you might want
Mhm.
more daytime and they don't. And then, so there's just so many things that can influence it.
Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. All of that stuff
Hmm.
has an impact.
Did anything surprise you in your research on this topic? Anything that really surprised you that you didn't know or you wouldn't have thought?
Um, not so much that it surprised me, but I mean, having it affirmed through science, it's a little bit of like, we sort of had a hunch that it was always like this. But because the historical models of talking about libido were very kind of male centric, and it was, this is what normal sexuality is, and it was this sort of, spontaneous, the Masters and Johnson model of the excitement, orgasm,
Mm,
plateau, resolution thing, which we know now is not true. That is not how human sexuality works. Yet, really, in the medical model, that is still the model that most doctors think about. So when they're prescribing Viagra and whatever else, that is the model that is traditionally still used, even though we know it doesn't really apply. It certainly doesn't apply to women, and it mostly doesn't even apply to men. But it was the model that became very, very popular. So as we understand more about different styles of arousal, such as, this responsive and spontaneous thing, but also the research from Rosemary Basson that came out about 25 years ago now, where she was the one who came up with this idea of arousal and desire being circular rather than linear, and that, desire can inform itself depending on what mental and emotional state we're in, that expecting that I'm just going to be horny as if by magic, and then I'm going to start having sex, that style of being in the mood doesn't really work for a lot of women, that sometimes we have to kind of start moving in the direction of sexy times, and then the desire comes after, but only if the type of sex that's being offered to us is of interest to us. And a lot of the time, if the sex that's being offered to us is not for our pleasure, which most of the time it's not, um, it can be very, very hard then to find desire if the sex that's being offered is really not what your body is hungry for. And then you say, actually, I would like this. And this may be not even sex,
mm,
but a partner who's like, well, no, I want to do oral sex on you. I want to give you pleasure. And she'll be like, but I don't want that. And
mm,
he's like, no, but I want you to have pleasure. And she's like, yeah, but that's not what brings me pleasure. I'm trying to tell you that this is what I want. And he's like, no, but I want to eat your pussy because that gives you pleasure. And she's like, you're not fucking listening to me. So, a lot of that is really this idea of, what is pleasure is incredibly subjective, but we are told that pleasure is orgasms and oral sex and all that kind of stuff. And, it can be that,
mm,
but for a lot of people, it's not. So this is where, was it surprising to me? No, but am I constantly slamming my head into a wall, explaining, especially to heterosexual men, that what they think is pleasure is often not how their wives and girlfriends experience it. And if you choose to not listen to the feedback you're given, that makes you a not very good lover.
mm. Listening's super important. Yeah.
Really.
A couple of quick
And they're
questions
like,
to
no,
ask
but I
everyone.
want to eat pussy. And it's like, well, you can, but if she doesn't want it, it's not for her, it's for you. And you're
Mm.
being annoying and a sex pest. Stop it.
A couple of questions to ask everyone. What's the book that changed your life?
Jack Morin, The Erotic Mind, the best
Okay.
sex book ever written.
Oh, wow.
Incredible. It came out in the 90s. I think it's still in press. You certainly can get secondhand copies around. Um, it's dated now. The language is a bit kind of, not old-fashioned. I mean, it's of its time, 20,
Mm,
35 years ago. But his insights were so ahead of their time. Like that is the book I think that informed people like Esther Perel. So much of what she talks about is borrowed from Jack Morin. He was the original thought leader around the way that contemporary sexologists formulate desire. He's incredible. Well, was. He's passed away now.
I'll check it out. What about a phrase or an affirmation that you live by?
I don't have any.
Okay.
I'm not into that kind of stuff personally.
Mm,
I'm much more how am I feeling in the moment? I don't have any. I don't have any rules. I mean, I guess a value that I live by rather than a phrase or an affirmation. A value that I hold is don't be mean.
Okay, that's good.
I really endeavor to not be mean. I can be powerful and I can say things that ruffle people's feathers, but I never do it from a place of intending to cause harm. I think the intention to cause harm is very dangerous. And so I try to be very, very mindful of not being mean.
Great, good intention. So where can people find you?
My website, cindydarnell.com, CYNDIDARNELL.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Orgasmic Lifestyle podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
You're welcome.